Story. I'm your host, Todd Nesloney, the Director of Culture and Strategic Leadership for TEPSA here in Texas. Each week, I look to bring you a different guest who has encouraged, inspired, or challenged me in one way or another and invite them on to tell some of their story in hopes that it inspires you to tell some of yours. I'm thrilled this week to have my friend Gary Aboud Jr. on with me. Gary, tell everybody a little bit about who you are.
Hey, Todd. Well, I appreciate being able to join you on the show tonight, and thanks so much for having me. So, Gary Aboud, I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I'm an educational consultant in private practice. Spent my career as a science educator and then a school administrator for a few years before branching out on my own. And now I do executive coaching with young adults as well as adults. And then I have a children's book that I recently published. And so I do a lot of work around early childhood science education related to that book and some different programs that we offer.
Now, Gary, I've been following you for quite a while, and it has been so cool to watch your journey and see all the different things that you've been able to kind of work with and be a part of. So we've got a lot I want to chat about here today. The first thing I want to talk about is, you've been in education for quite a while. Is that a path that you always saw for yourself?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's one that I love answering, so I appreciate you asking. No, actually, education was my plan B, so to speak. So the A plan for me was always to go into medicine from a young age. And that was partly because of my own personal experience as a patient. So I grew up with an eye disease that took my sight at a young age. And I spent the better part of the first half of my life with a lot of difficulty seeing and visual impairment. And by the time I got to college, I guess legally blind would probably be the right term to put on it. And so it got me interested in medicine, and I knew that I always wanted to help people the way that I had been helped. Eventually, I had cornea transplant surgery, and it restored my sight. It was, totally a miracle. I went from not being able to drive or read a textbook to being able to see 20/20. So medicine had always interested me. But one of the things that I found out as I got closer to applying to medical school is that if your vision wasn't, let's say, reliable enough, that it's really difficult to go into that field. And so among a few other things, that was something that really caused me to consider, what's the realistic nature of a path in that direction. And so for a few different reasons, that being one of them, I decided to go in a different direction. And so one of the mentors that I had in college helped me to see that I had teaching as a gift and that science and teaching went together really well. And that's what ended up leading me in the direction of science education. And so I went, after I got my bachelor's degree, I went and got a degree to be a teacher and went into teaching.
I love that. I want to talk about some of the eye stuff real quick because it's so interesting to me. How old were you when you had the cornea transplant?
Yeah, so I was 21 and 22 respectively. So they do each eye separately. And so I had one done when I was 21, one when I was 22. So it was late in my college career. I had managed to get by with contact lenses for a long time, but eventually the disease progression just got to the point where I couldn't have my vision corrected well enough with anything else, and the only option left was the surgery.
Was it one of those, obviously you're losing your sight, so there's that fear of not having sight at some point, but did you also find yourself with that fear of what if this surgery completely takes it all away today?
Yeah, it's not something that crossed my mind exactly at that time. I was really hopeful that everything was going to go just as, kind of advertised in the way that they tell you that it can go. So I was very much optimistic about it. And I had faith that it was going to be the best possible outcome. But, I was prepared that, there's risks to it and that you might have to deal with those if they did pan out.
So now, with this kind of eye disease, is this like when you were born, was your sight normal and then it just got progressively worse? Or was it always something that wasn't ever quite what everybody else was seeing?
Yeah, so it's something that from childhood just got progressively worse. So I didn't know any different in grade school. And one of my teachers called home and said, your son's squinting to see the board. You might want to take him to the doctor. And so my parents took me when I was like 10 years old, and I found out that I had an eye disease called keratoconus, which basically the cornea, the front clear part of your eye, instead of being round like your eye, ends up becoming cone shaped. And it makes everything look like a rainy windshield, just blurry in general. And that got progressively worse and worse over time. And eventually, I could see light and I could see shapes and I could make out a couple of things. But in general, unless I was, maybe an arm's length away, I'd have a real difficult time knowing who I was talking to or what I was really seeing.
Did you find that, I mean, you said you got contacts and things like that while going through school. Did you find the eye concerns playing heavily into your education at all?
I did. And there were a couple of things that were kind of a big impact. In grade school, it was mild, and so glasses got me by. When I got to high school and it got worse, I needed special contact lenses to help literally reshape the structure of my cornea so that it was pushed back to being round. And so one of the things that was really difficult is I also had really bad allergies. And for anybody who wears contact lenses, that allergies can be a complication for contact lens wear. And that was definitely true for me. And so keeping my contact lenses in was a challenge at times. So in my education, I had audiobooks for, classes where there was a lot of reading. I remember really, really specifically reading the Scarlet letter in an English class on a cassette tape at the time, which I know that might date me for some of the people listening. But so, different accommodations like that. I had a 504 plan when I took the ACT and I took AP tests. I had giant font and I had these pages that looked like poster board instead of the regular test booklet. And so those kind of things were there to accommodate the visual difficulties I had. But fortunately, that was the only difficulty that I had to overcome was the vision. And so I made my way around it. I was able to play tennis for a few years in school. The contact lenses were good enough to give me vision to be able to do that. I played the piano in high school. That was a big thing for me. I was really into music growing up. And so I was able to do a lot of things, but like I said, as it got progressively worse, that limited more and more what I was able to do and did interfere more and more with my ability to read textbooks in college, where things got a little heavier in terms of the studying and demanded more of that.
Right. It's such an interesting thing to me, when you are someone who, just specifically with sight, who is born seeing something your whole life. I mean, I can just imagine those moments for you when you got the contacts or glasses or surgery and things just are dramatically clearer. What a difference that makes. And so I guess my next question for you would be, I love how you have taken your love of science and your love of education, and you've written this new children's book that I absolutely love. So tell me a little bit about this book, or tell our listeners about it.
Yeah, so Science with Scarlet is a children's book geared towards elementary and early childhood learners. And it's written in rhyming verse, all about this little girl scientist. Her name is Scarlet, and she does experiments with her teddy bear assistant. And they involve the reader in a really interactive teaching style to be able to ask the reader to make predictions and to generate and test their hypotheses throughout the book. This book in particular is the first in a series of science books that's going to come out. And it's all about the science of color vision. So it's all about how our eyes work, all about our gift of sight. And so as you kind of mentioned, it does crosswalk a few different things that are really important and passions for me in life. So this is a book that's really near and dear to my heart because it comes from some of my favorite science experiments that I got to do as a high school physics and chemistry teacher. And I decided when I had a daughter who was really young that I wanted to share my love of science with her. And what better way to do that with a young learner than through a book? But I couldn't find a book that was doing the type of science, interactivity, and teaching that I wanted. There were a lot of nonfiction titles out there, but my young daughter at 3 years old, she wanted characters and rhymes, and she wanted fun. And so I thought, well, if I can't find something, I'm an innovative guy, maybe I'll make something. I've made lessons for all kinds of different things. This is just like making another lesson, right? So I'll just put it in book form. Definitely easier said than done. But the project over the course of the last couple of years became a reality, which was a really, really great thing. And it's taken off. It's been really popular with the schools that I've been able to visit and the groups that I've been able to present to. And the kids that I've been able to read it with and share it with have just all loved it, which has been great. So, the big thing that I love to tell people about is not only does it communicate about science and literacy and use fictional characters to teach in a fun way, but it also is a social responsibility project.
Mm-hmm.
So what I mean by that is the 15% of the proceeds from this book are being donated to a vision nonprofit called Eversight. And Eversight is a group that's dedicated to restoring sight and preventing blindness for people like me who need cornea transplants or have vision-related issues that require some kind of surgery or research related to eye and tissue donation. And so it's been a great way to be able to raise awareness for the work that Eversight is doing, as well as the need for organ, tissue, and eye donors out there. And so I know my own personal story, I was able to connect with 2 different families who had loved ones that passed away, unfortunately, and were gracious enough to give the gift of sight to someone else by donating their corneas.
Wow.
And that's what allowed me to be able to see again.
Yeah.
And it allowed me to finish college, become an award-winning educator, start a family, and to be able to live the life that I now have. And none of that would have been possible without that gift of sight. And so I just think it's so important to be able to tell that story alongside the story of science and literacy and education.
Well, I love the fact that you're giving back, and you're giving back to something that's super personal to you. To me, that makes such a big difference. But when I read this book, I love that, when I look for science books, especially that I'm going to introduce to kids with characters and things, I mean, the cutesy, the rhymes, all that's great, but I love how you weren't afraid to throw in the real science vocabulary in there. And it's such a great tool to use to teach kids, where not only are the graphics great, the story's fantastic, but there's so much learning that happens in that book. Was that really a sticking point for you? Like, you're like, I just don't want to write a cutesy chapter or cutesy kids book. There's got to be some meat in there too.
That's absolutely a great way to put it, and it did. One of the first goals that I had is I wanted it to be something that would teach somebody something. And I thought about the lengths to which the people that taught me about teaching went to make sure that I understood that you can't just tell people what it is you want them to know, that you have to give them a learning experience. You've got to make it experiential. You've got to give them something to participate with. It needs to be image rich, needs to be connected. And that all kind of spelled out this acronym that I remember learning as a new teacher, EPIC. And it was all about make things epic for the learner. And I learned that in my classroom. And when I came and approached this project for writing, I thought, well, how can I do that in a book fashion? And I kind of researched the different children's literature that was out there, found some different interactive styles that I thought could work, and then just kind of made it translate to the work I was doing. But you're absolutely right. I didn't want this to just be another story about science. I wanted it to be a story that would teach science, so that a teacher could use it in their classroom and a parent could read it for fun with their child at home. And it would have both effects and be as rich for both of those audiences as it would be for the other.
I love that. Well, but when writing this book, was there something that you learned, or something that you learned about yourself through the process of putting this children's book together?
I learned a lot of things. If I had to boil it down, I would say I have a far greater appreciation for the writing process than I ever did before.
Yes.
And that may sound really simple to somebody listening who's like, well, yeah, it's a big process. But you just don't realize when you go into writing that everything you ever learned about writing is there for a very specific reason. And I think that sometimes, I would say this as a teacher as well as a learner myself, sometimes that message gets lost on students because they're so often writing things for their teachers only. And I know this is something that you touch on in your work and in your books, that it's sometimes when there's not an authentic audience, sometimes when it isn't a project that has a personal connection and passion for somebody that's doing it, you miss some of those important subtleties and some of the nuances about the stuff you're learning. And I know for me, I did a lot of writing in my career. Writing is a strength that I've developed over time by working at it. But it wasn't until I started creating things for myself and what I wanted to write that I really started to appreciate the writing process for all it's worth.
And you're totally right. I never appreciated the writing process until I had to write myself. And then I was like, oh, there's all these things we were taught for a reason.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think you're totally true right there. Well, Gary, when you look at your life and you look at all the great experiences you've been through, all the trials, everything that goes into being who you are today, what is something that you look back on and think that played a really pivotal role into the man I am today?
I got to pick one thing on
I
that.
know there's lots. I know.
I would say for me, I'm a man of faith, and for me, God's presence and His work in my life is probably the answer to your question.
Right.
Because, like, if I look back now, I didn't always see it so clearly that God was working in my life, but when I look back, it's like the trail of breadcrumbs that led Hansel and Gretel. Like it, you look back and you just go, all these things could not have just been coincidences that were there. All these experiences couldn't have just happened and formed me the way that they are and the way that they did. And from with my science brain, I go, well, sure, there could be coincidences. But then I think, no, in my science classroom, when we took data as in experiments and different things came coming up over and over again and they formed a certain pattern, we didn't call them coincidences after a certain point. We said they point to something bigger. And for me, if I look back in my life, those experiences of getting cornea transplants where someone else's tragedy was able to be worked in the favor of my getting my sight back, being able to graduate, meet my wife, become a teacher when I never set out to be one. Just it goes on and on. Winning Michigan Teacher of the Year in 2014, something that, 1 out of 100,000 teachers in Michigan gets selected for this honor. And it put me into a cohort of 50 people in the country from every state and others from territories that are selected similarly in their states. These experiences, you can't make this up. So when I look back, those experiences were all really personally forming for me, but it's really, I think, the work that God's done in my life to be able to make those things possible and help me be able to see that and make the most of it for what I have.
I love that. Well, I always believe that there are people in our lives that play a really big part in our story, and who we are today. And when you look at all your life outside of family, who's someone that has really played a role into your story?
Yeah, this is a really important question. I appreciate that. And I'm sure that anybody listening can think of a handful of people that would fit that bill. For me, I come back to probably two people who were really pivotal for me in my career. And one was before I became a teacher, and one was after. So before I became a teacher, I worked at a hospital doing research as one of my college experiences, kind of in preparation for medical school. And I had a mentor there named Nancy. And Nancy was a really terrific mentor for me. She was a very friendly person, very real, straight talking person. And she was one of the people that I think had the biggest impact on helping me to see that my true calling in my life wasn't medicine, but that it was actually education.
Right.
And if it weren't for her, I probably would not have gone into teaching. So she was a really big influence for me in my career. And then once I made that decision to go into teaching, a big influence for me was actually one of my own high school teachers. His name is Don Pata. And Don was my high school physics teacher. He's also an award-winning educator. And he was one of the first people that I contacted when I got into teaching and said, hey, could I come and watch you teach and kind of see it from a different angle? And he was like, sure, come on by. And what ended up happening is I ended up getting to teach alongside him at my alma mater one day. And we spent several years teaching together, and he mentored me in my own classroom to be able to learn from a master teacher like him how to do it in a masterful way. And that really formed and shaped the way that I teach and kind of the philosophy that I have on education to this day.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I love what you said at the top of that story, which was the fact that all of us can think of different people in our lives whenever you'd say who has played a role, and everybody plays a different role at a different time and a different season. That helps grow us into the person we are today. Well, Gary, one of the questions that I always love to end my conversations on is if there was one thing you wish more people knew or understood, what would your one thing be?
Ooh, I love this question, and it's going to sound like a total deviation from everything we've talked about. But as I kind of said at the top of the show, the work that I do now as an educational consultant involves doing executive coaching with young people and adults.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the groups of people that I love working with most are individuals who have special needs. And so we do a lot of work with persons with learning disabilities, ADHD, autism, and I have grown to have a big heart for individuals with ADHD. I look back on my teaching career and find that students with ADHD were always in my classroom and that I always had a special connection and rapport with them. And so one of the things I wish more people knew is that they knew that ADHD is something that is real. It's a medical condition, and it causes a lot of students in our classrooms to have difficulties that don't seem like they fit what we would expect. And they make things difficult, from being organized, managing your time, being able to balance your emotions, be able to respond to stressful things correctly. With a neurological disorder like ADHD, it can make everyday tasks more difficult than they have to be, and they can cause even the brightest of individuals to come across really scattered. But if you don't know enough about what's going on there, it can look like students who have ADHD are being lazy or defiant or just not caring. They're being apathetic. And I know that unfortunately this stereotype kind of comes out in classrooms around the country, and for no lack of good intent, everybody wants to say that their students are capable of more, and they certainly are.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes we don't recognize that the true difficulties that students face are barriers that are beyond their control. And so I just wish that more people would take the time to learn a little bit more about something like ADHD that has, I think, more prevalence than we might realize, and has more impact on classrooms and student behavior than we sometimes might admit. And that little bit of understanding, I think, can go a long way for some of the behaviors that we see students exhibit that sometimes can be very frustrating in classroom situations.
I totally agree. And I love that you ended our conversation on that, because it's something I completely am passionate about, and love that you speak about so much. Well, Gary, I admire your work greatly. I've followed you for years. I love your children's book, Science with Scarlet. So thank you so much for coming on and having a chat with me tonight. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise, Todd. Appreciate the work you're doing, and always appreciate getting to catch up with you. Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for listening.
Yes, thank you everybody for listening or watching another episode of Tell Your Story. Remember, you can check out past episodes on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts, it's there. I hope tonight's conversation with Gary has inspired you to get out there and share your story, because every story matters.